My name is Boston City Councilor Matt O'Malley, and I am the chair of the Council's Committee on the Environment and Sustainability. Today we are here to discuss docket number 1465. This is a message in order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend the amount of $200,000 in the form of a grant for the Betablox grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation to be administered by the Mayor's Office. This grant will fund experiments that aim to improve civic life by supporting Boston's efforts to create a process for deploying sensors in urban environments. This matter was sponsored by Mayor Walsh and referred to the committee last month on November 29th of 2017. We're obviously having a hearing today because we need to take action on it by tomorrow at the final council hearing of the year. As I mentioned, this grant would fund experiments that aim to improve civic life by supporting the City of Boston's effort to create a process for deploying sensors in urban environments. Deploying sensors have been proven to help identify environmental issues and air quality concerns. As the chair of the Council's Committee on Environment and Sustainability, I am always looking for new ways our city can be more sustainable and combat the efforts of climate change. As I've said far too often over these last 11 months, there is an utter lack of leadership coming from Washington as it relates to combating climate change, so it's really up to cities, towns, and states to lead in this space, and I've been grateful to partner with the administration on a whole host of issues to that end. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation announced a $1.2 million grant which will support 6 cities, Akron, Ohio, Boston, Detroit, Miami, Philadelphia, and San Jose, California, to explore how the Internet of Things, the connection of everyday objects to the Internet, can be deployed in cities in responsible and equitable ways. It's also imperative, as we'll get into in a moment, that the information that we collect shall be presented aggregated in an anonymous, unidentifiable form. The Advisory Council for this effort should include representatives of privacy and civil liberties groups and should have oversight of projects that involve identifiable and sensitive data collection. So we'll get right to it. We're joined by 2 gentlemen from the administration, Chris Carter, who's the co-chair of the Mayor's Office of Urban Mechanics, and Stephen Webster? Walter, I'm sorry. I can't read my writing.
That's my alias, Stephen Webster.
Stephen Webster. Walter Webster. Stephen Walter, the program manager for the Office of New Urban Mechanics as well. Gentlemen, welcome. Do you want to just give an overview, and then we'll just get into some Q&A. And before you do that, as I mentioned, we have several folks in the audience. If anyone would like to testify, we will be happy to stay here as long as needed. Please sign up in the back. This is being taped and broadcast, streamed on the internet, as well as on Comcast Channel 8 and RCN 82. And I just ask every member of the audience to please silence your cell phones and other devices. Gentlemen.
Councilor, thank you for having us here today and making sure we get this on the agenda for the council meeting tomorrow before the end of the year. We appreciate that. I'm going to give just a quick overview of sort of the landscape that this grant sort of takes place in, and then Stephen, who's been instrumental in applying for this funding and helping us think through how we're going to utilize it, will give sort of a little bit more detail as to the grant. So this comes in the context of smart cities, which is too often a buzzword, and the City of Boston has been a little bit of a smart city skeptic in a good way, right? That we don't just assume that technology and data is going to instantly make all things better, that there's a lot of robust conversations that need to happen with the public, with researchers, with technology companies, and with government to make this sort of, all these things work for the residents of Boston, the visitors of Boston, and how we sort of improve our city, whether it's environmentally or whether it's for social needs or for displays of public art or otherwise. We've been building a body of work sort of in this smart cities space over the last few years. Everything from experimentation with how we use camera technology as a new way to understand intersections, right? So we've done a pilot on at the intersection of Beacon Street and Mass Ave with Verizon last year, where we sort of used cameras, we used other sensors to understand the movements of people through that to try to make that a safer space. We've done experiments with sort of people's own data submission, right? Sort of this idea of a citizen scientist through the Boston Safest Driver campaign, an app you can download that sort of explores and asks people to reflect on their own driving experience. Again, sort of a personalized sensor that is then aggregating this data, as you said, anonymously, and providing some information not only to that user, but back to the city as a whole to understand where is distracted driving taking place across the city. And the Mayor's Office of Newer Mechanics, in collaboration with Department of Innovation and Technology, have put together a playbook on smart cities as well. A sort of a framing of where we think things are headed right now, and what's the conversations we should be having with this community, with our residents about smart cities. So all of this is sort of funneled into a series of questions about how do we move forward? How do we make the experimentation easier, and how do we make sure we're experimenting with the right things by having the right conversations and robust conversations with community members. So to that end, the Mayor's Office of Newer Mechanics submitted to the Knight Foundation to apply for funding to sort of begin those conversations. So I'll let Stephen talk a little bit more in depth about what we're hoping to accomplish with this.
Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so we get 2 phone calls every day from some tech company or firm wanting to experiment in the city streets, which is a great thing. Boston is a hive of innovation here. But one of the problems is, there's no real clear gatekeeping process for how we determine who gets to put in a sensor or try a smart city experiment, and for whom that's benefiting, and what sort of civic value is actually being produced. And there are clear, fine lines between what these companies are after on an experimental research or, sort of product end, and what would benefit the people of the city. And so what the Betablox project really is kind of trying to take a step back and think more deeply about the values behind how we decide to go forward with certain experiments, who we want to work with, and for whom these technologies are serving, and who they're leaving out. And that's a huge factor in the whole smart city, Internet of Things ecosystem. And so, I think the Betablox process it's less of, well, we're aiming it so it's less of a specific thing that we're throwing in the streets, but rather an invitation to the community and to companies and researchers and whoever is interested to help guide the conversation over what we do. And so from this, we hope to create a kind of clearinghouse between community issues, questions, challenges, concerns, and these tech companies, researchers, artists, designers, people who may have something that can help in some way. How do we create better, more meaningful, sustained partnerships where real civic value is actually being produced? And through this process, also thinking about what a public privacy policy looks like. A lot of this is unchecked, and as you mentioned, the federal government is not only not really playing a major role now, but they're also sort of taking a step back and rolling things back, and we think this is incredibly dangerous. And so, through this process, we hope to create an advisory council, but more importantly, create partnerships when it comes to actually experimenting real things. So it's not just abstract, that we have people with us throughout the whole process, from planning stages to implementation to evaluation.
As a small sort of micro example of this, last night our office, along with BARI, which is the Boston Area Research Initiative, and Do It, put together a Meet the Kiosk panel. So in Codman Square last night, we brought in some smart city technology providers from across the space that are doing kiosk type work, members of government, members of the research community, and then members of the Codman Square neighborhood, and the ACLU as well, to have a debate about what this means. Should the city be thinking about kiosks? What's the trade-offs that we're going to make? What are the trade-offs in privacy that people maybe aren't aware of, that we should have a really thoughtful conversation about? Those types of things, we're feeling like we need to bring more structure to, as Stephen said, and make sure that we're being thoughtful about who has access to the streets. How are we sort of thinking about the permitting process behind this, even those sort of nuts and bolts governance and those privacy discussions with the ACLU at the table, with residents at the table, with libraries at the table, to make sure that we're doing this in a thoughtful way. So with that, we'll open up to you, Councilor.
Thank you. So in full disclosure, I have to announce that I worked with the Smart City Initiative and some residents and business owners in Jamaica Plain earlier this year, actually. It began last year, but we were able to secure funding for the Sidewalk Butler project, which has been a resounding success, and would love to see that grow across the city. It's a disposal system for discarded cigarette butts and a safe sort of tube where they would smolder out any chance of fire, and then they will be recycled. So it's, we hope we can get people to not smoke, but at least we can recycle the cigarette butts until they quit. And the Smart City initiative was really helpful with that. So this is a $200,000 grant. So is this going to hire staff, or is this, explain exactly what the sort of nuts and bolts of the grant will go towards?
I think we're currently in the process of figuring this out, but I think a large majority of it will go toward creating the social infrastructure for bringing people together and creating these partnerships. So what does
that mean?
There are certain face-to-face convenings that we want to have happen at certain branch libraries, potentially throughout the city, where people can meet face-to-face, but also thinking about what an online presence looks like. If I'm a community member and I want to, put in sensors on my block to measure the pollution levels or measure speeding levels, maybe I think we need some, traffic calming measures. Is there some easy online way, some platform that we can create that connects those challenges with people, with technologists, startups that have some solution that are also looking to experiment in the public sphere? And so thinking...
So the money will be used, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by this, and I really think, I love it when cities embrace technology to address many of these issues, so you have me with this. But would this be the city contracting with a firm to create a platform that would work with the city, or would we do it in-house at Do It, and this would sort of help offset that cost?
It's too early to say. So in our proposal, we said that we would use some of this for staffing, some of that $200,000 for staffing, and whether we're contracting for a service and a design service and facilitation service, or whether we're using some of that as a part-time program manager, we're sort of fleshing out those details depending on which direction we end up going sort of initially with the grant.
And is this a one-time grant, or is this?
It is a one-time grant.
So, I mean, $200,000 is a lot of money, but this isn't like we could bring on 4 staffers, in perpetuity.
We're not going to add an FTE position.
Okay. And then so that's one part of it, is that it would sort of be used to help some staffing level, either internally or put out RFPs to sort of help create a different platform on a specific issue, as well as help mediate a community process, a meeting. It's going to pay for event space and a facilitator and food and that type of stuff.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Correct.
And so this is early enough in the process that this isn't used for a specific project. We're not going to sign off on this and then you guys are going to put sensors up, on Center Street in Jamaica Plain, and we're going to study smog emissions from cars. We're going to decide how we're going to use these Betablox and sort of what, and who's going to make that decision. Is it going to be a sort of community-driven conversation?
Yeah, that is the purpose of this, right? Is to have those conversations before we deploy anything, and to understand what are the needs and wants of a community, and how do they want to be involved in this.
Right. What would you sort of see as a worthwhile piloted program that perhaps some other cities have done that you think we can do? I mean, the Boston Safest Driver, I think, is great. I know there was some talk about one that would, an app that would discover potholes and then sort of immediately generate a report to the Public Works yard. So what's something that you'd like to see come out of this program, both of you, or either of you?
Yeah. So one of the, we're constantly thinking about how we can make the city's sidewalks more accessible, and for across many audiences, many people who use them. And they're the street furniture, for instance, that has a technology component to it that we've experimented in the past. There's a company called Sufa that we've worked with. They're based out of Cambridge. They make solar-powered benches.
There's one at Jamaica Pond.
Exactly. It's a great one. I've used it many times. So thinking about small little acts of convenience that also play a big role in the quality and well-being of people walking in the city streets, to thinking about the research community and how difficult it is for them to do experiments that require power or internet connectivity, or simply just a place to latch on. There's a very inequitable process right now when a large software or large hardware company has the means to do these things, to deploy technology, but a research group at a local university simply does not, and certainly a community group or an advocacy organization. So we want to create a more level playing field when it comes to plug and play, so to speak, in the streets.
Yeah, a simple example might be there's sort of research that says that 30% of the vehicles traveling our city streets are circulating for parking, right? And there's been some researchers that have been interested in, can we deploy, a sensor network in a gridded area to understand, is that actually true? Is that accurate? And if you are changing the policies around parking in those areas, like the performance-based parking project that's going on in the Back Bay or the Seaport, can you measure that impact in the circulation of vehicles in that area? So that type of thing. And there's a whole bunch of conversation we need to have around privacy and what happens to that data and how is it collected and how do people sort of feel about it before we would do something like that. But there are cities that have ventured down that path with researchers, and that type of thing is interesting and has a nice environmental component to it as well, reducing the amount of emissions, local point source emissions in an area.
I think that I'd take it one step further in terms of parking, primarily when you talk about driving around, that seems to be more of the downtown neighborhoods, but certainly one thing that we're dealing with increased frequency in some of the more far-flung neighborhoods, like where I represent, is that you've got parking restrictions during the day, resident-only parking, usually because of close proximity to a train station or commuter rail station, and many of these sit empty during the day, so it could be some good data collection in terms of perhaps coming up with a better system in place as we talk about the Complete Streets program and encouraging more people to not use cars and not park cars and use public transit. So this is, my question is, a question I prepared was how many sensors are planned for deployment, but it sounds like we don't know the answer to that yet.
We don't. One thing I'd like to add too is, when it comes to deploying sensors or smart city tech, there are the sort of usual suspects for the neighborhoods in Boston that get this stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things we really want to focus on in this grant is expanding it to different neighborhoods. Yeah. But contextualizing it. So not just throwing in kiosks that we think people could use, but working with those, I shouldn't even say neighborhoods, oftentimes it's block level, what they need or what they could use, what they don't want to see. And so that is like probably the number one goal of this project, is to bring them into the conversation and contextualize these technologies on that level of granularity.
Well, you're speaking my language there, because I think it's really important that we make sure that we use a lot of this technological, advancement in the neighborhoods that may not have had it. This is terrific. So, and then the other question is what kind of data will be collected from these sensors, but I assume that too is to be determined.
Yeah. To be
depending
determined
on what the project's going to be.
Yes.
So there was an article today in the Boston Herald, some concerns from some privacy rights organization that this would potentially capture some information in an unfair and sort of untransparent way. So can you address how you're going to address? Can you talk about how you're going to address those concerns?
So the comments that were in the Herald from the ACLU, from Cade, I think we're spot on, right? These are the same conversations that we're having about data collection. How do we protect residents from unwanted privacy breaches of personally identifiable information? And that's part of this process, right? We want to have that conversation with residents, and we want to bring people that are maybe either researchers or technology providers to the table to say, what are you actually collecting and why, and where does it go, and who owns it, and how does it get redistributed or resold if that happens in your sort of current deployments, and how do we sort of create this public privacy policy that Stephen sort of alluded to, so that everyone is very clear about, if you're providing this information, you're collecting this data, this is what happens to it, and this is what the city will use it for, and at what level of aggregation it's being collected. I mean, the ACLU and others, there's other community groups that have been really out front on this, and I think we see them as a strength in Boston, right? This sort of skepticism here is really healthy to that sort of broader flash of smart cities, and I think we take pride here in the city of being on the leading front of not just technology, but thoughtful deployments of technology.
No, great, Chris, and I appreciate that. So will you commit that the ACLU and other privacy rights organizations will have a seat at the table as we talk about an advisory council, as we talk about sort of the community process?
Yeah, we will certainly involve them in the conversation.
And then again, there'll be sort of a, any collection of data will be discussed and sort of fleshed out what will and what cannot be kept out in a transparent and open manner.
Yes,
And I assume there were
certainly.
probably some restrictions from the Knight Foundation to address that concern as well.
Yeah, this is of great interest to them as well, which
Okay.
is why they're funding it. And I think we look at some opportunities with libraries that might be a really interesting way to help with that showcasing of transparency data as well as sort of that analysis of the data and sort of facilitating that conversation with residents.
Okay. And you did an RFI on this issue in December of last year, right around a year ago today, and how many vendors submitted submissions?
Over 100 responses
Over
to
100.
that RFI, and interviewed, gosh, 30 or 40 of those just to sort of understand business models and practices out of that. It was really just to sort of get a picture of the landscape of smart cities and then pick off the things that maybe seem the most interesting for us to sort of go a little bit deeper on.
So, perfect. So just so I have this right, because I will vote, ask my colleagues for a favorable vote tomorrow. This is a $200,000 grant. It's going to be used to it's going to be used to fund the process of administrating the Betablox grant. What that means is it's going to help fund a robust community process in every neighborhood, or I don't want to say every neighborhood because we have many, but
For $200,000, I don't know if we can get to every neighborhood, but we will do our best.
But a neighborhood, a citywide process with special attention to non-downtown neighborhoods, and no offense to the downtown neighborhoods, I love them, but to make sure that there's sort of an equity in deployment, as well as working either with someone internally, a city employee, or perhaps working with another firm to create some sort of a platform. Well, the first aspect, and cut me off if I have this wrong, but as I understand, the first aspect is to identify sort of what needs, what desires that we should, what problems we should be addressing, and then the second phase is how do we address those problems. So that could be working with creating a new platform internally or externally, and throughout this process there'll be a community sort of not oversight, because I don't necessarily like that word, but a community participatory process where folks will make sure that information is kept anonymous and not shared and doesn't violate anyone's sort of right to privacy that we all cherish. So
That's an excellent summary.
okay?
Thank you, Councilor.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Last question: who is Boston's safest driver?
There's a young woman from West Roxbury who won the award last year. Yeah,
I'm very-
who was competing with her 17-year-old daughter at the time.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
So
fantastic.
they got into the competition together, and she bested her daughter by a few points.
Oh wow! And what did that person win?
Uh,
Other than
I believe the
bragging
grand,
rights.
the grand prize was $2,000.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
Oh, I thought
so
you were going
not
to say
small.
a city council resolution. So that's
Yeah. Yeah, so not a small win. As a follow-up to that, the city of Seattle launched Seattle's Safest Driver
Yep.
as a direct sort of derivative of the project that we land. So that actually launched last week, and New York City is exploring it as well. So as Boston goes, so goes the nation.
indeed, in more ways than one. Well, gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough. Again, I will be asking my colleagues to vote favorably on this tomorrow. I am very interested in this, so we don't have to do it as a formalized council hearing, but I'd like to ask you if maybe we could do, if you would both be willing, maybe in the spring, to sort of meet with councilors and myself and just sort of just give us an update on where we are, and obviously we'd publicly notice that, so that'd be worth it for
Happy
you
to do
guys.
that.
Perfect, and it'll be open to the public. All right, any people wishing to testify, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, this hearing is hereby adjourned. We will ask for a favorable vote tomorrow on docket number 1465. And thank you, Kate Sullivan, for the final City Council Committee on Environment and Sustainability hearing of 2017.